I never saw it coming, the day she dropped the bombshell. "Let's have an open marriage," she said, like she was suggesting a new TV show to binge. It hit me like a freight train, but I kept my cool. "Sure," I said, but inside, I knew we were done. An open marriage? That wasn't me. I'm a one-woman man. Always have been. But if that's what she wanted, I wasn't going to stop her. I decided right then, I'd find someone new, someone who wanted me and only me. I started hitting the usual spots, the bars and clubs, but this time with a different purpose. I was on the hunt, not just to forget but to start anew. And that's when I met Jane. It was like fate. She was there, radiant, laughing at a joke her friend made. Our eyes met, and something just clicked. We talked, and it was like we'd known each other for years. She got me. The next thing I knew, we were meeting up whenever we could, keeping it hush-hush, of course. Meanwhile, my wife was living it up, going out more, staying out late. I guess she thought I was doing the same, playing the field. Little did she know, I wasn't playing. I was serious about Jane. She was everything my wife wasn't. Every moment with Jane was electric, full of life. We'd spend hours just talking, or sometimes not talking, just being together. It was weird, juggling life like that. By day, I was still playing the part of the devoted husband, but by night, I was with Jane, exploring this new, exciting connection. It was exhilarating but also exhausting, living a double life. But I couldn't stop. Jane was like a drug, and I was addicted. So, there I was, stuck between two worlds. The world I knew was crumbling, but the new one with Jane was just beginning. And I knew I had to choose. But it wasn't really a choice, was it? Jane had already stolen my heart. You know that feeling when you're doing something you shouldn't, and it's only a matter of time before you get caught? That was me, all over. I could see it in her eyes, the way she looked at me, like she was trying to figure out a puzzle. "You seem distant," she'd say, and I'd brush it off with some half-hearted excuse. "Work stress," I'd tell her, "too much on my mind." But the truth? The truth was Jane. One weekend, I told my wife I had a work conference out of town. Total lie. I was with Jane, up at her family's cabin in the woods. No cell service, just us and the endless sky. It was perfect. Like a different world where I could be someone else, someone not tangled up in a mess of a marriage. Jane and I spent the whole time hiking, talking, and forgetting the world. I was living a double life and loving it. But you can't keep something like that under wraps forever. The wife was no fool. She started asking questions, the kind that dug under your skin. Where was the conference? Who was there? Why didn't I call? I stuck to my story, but it was like holding water in my hands, slipping away, no matter how tight I gripped. Despite the mounting pressure at home, I couldn't give up Jane. She was like a breath of fresh air after being underwater too long. We'd meet up in secret, steal moments together. It was risky, thrilling, and it made everything else bearable. But with every stolen kiss, every whispered promise, the gap between me and my wife grew wider. Then, one evening, my wife broke down. She confided in her friend, pouring out all her worries and fears. What she didn't know was that her friend was a link to my other world. This friend knew Jane, had seen us together. It was a small town. People talked. My wife's friend listened, nodding, but what was she thinking? Was she going to spill everything? I lay in bed that night, my wife asleep beside me, her tears dried on her cheeks. I stared at the ceiling, trapped in a web of my own making. The thrill of the affair was fading, replaced by a gnawing dread. I was in too deep, and there was no easy way out. Every choice seemed wrong. Every step led further into the maze. And somewhere, in the back of my mind, I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The day the truth came out, it hit like a hurricane. My wife's friend, bless her heart, let slip about Jane. It was one of those moments where everything freezes, and you can almost hear the crack as your world splits in two. When I got home that night, the air was thick with tension. My wife was sitting in the living room, a storm brewing in her eyes. Is it true? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. I could have lied, could have tried to wiggle out of it, but what was the point? The jig was up. Yes, I said, and with that single word, I watched her heart break. I told her I was leaving, that I was going to stay with Jane. It was brutal, like ripping off a band-aid, but I believed it was for the best. Better a painful truth than a comforting lie, right? She begged me to stay, tears streaming down her face. We can fix this, she said, clutching at straws. I'll do anything. But it was too late. I'd crossed a line, and there was no going back. I packed a bag with the essentials, feeling like a stranger in my own home. Moving in with Jane was surreal. Her place was a stark contrast to the life I'd just left. It was new, exciting, but also scary. I was stepping into the unknown, leaving behind a decade of memories. My wife didn't give up easily. She called, texted, even showed up at Jane's place a couple of times. It was heart-wrenching, seeing her like that, desperate, broken. But I was firm. I told her it was over, that she needed to move on. Harsh, maybe, but I thought it was kinder in the long run. Those first few weeks were a blur. The thrill of being with Jane was overshadowed by the guilt and the fallout of my decision. I turned my life upside down, and there was no turning back. I wondered if I'd made a huge mistake, but every time I looked at Jane, I remembered why I'd done it. Life with Jane was different. We didn't have the history I had with my wife, but maybe that was a good thing. We were building something new, something that was ours alone. But as I lay in bed at night, listening to Jane's breathing, I couldn't help but think of my wife, alone in the house we used to share. I'd moved on, but at what cost? The thing about new beginnings is that they're often wrapped in the end of something else. With Jane, every day felt like a fresh start. Our relationship was gaining ground, getting stronger. We talked about the future, about what we wanted and where we saw ourselves. It was like building a dream with someone who shared the same blueprint. Meanwhile, I heard through the grapevine that my wife was having a tough time. It's strange, to think about someone who was your everything struggling because of a choice you made. She was coming to terms with the reality of our situation, the weight of her proposal for an open marriage finally sinking in. I guess neither of us really understood the consequences until it was too late. Jane and I decided to take a trip abroad, get away from all the noise and mess. It was a romantic getaway, the kind you see in movies. We explored ancient cities, lounged on exotic beaches, and dined under the stars. For a brief time, I managed to forget everything else. It was just me and Jane, and the world seemed to revolve around us. Back home, my wife was dealing with the fallout. I could picture her in our old house, surrounded by memories of a life we built together. I won't lie, it made me feel guilty. But at the same time, I knew I couldn't go back. I had chosen a different path, and I had to see it through, no matter how hard it was. After the trip, reality came crashing back. It was time to make things official, to close the chapter on my marriage. Filing for divorce wasn't easy. It's one thing to walk away, but another to put it down on paper, to formally end a decade of togetherness. But it had to be done. I hired a lawyer, signed the papers, and braced myself for the final goodbye. Throughout it all, Jane was my rock. She understood my struggles, gave me space when I needed it, and was there to listen when I needed to talk. Our bond deepened through these challenges, making us realize that we were indeed serious about each other. It was a bittersweet time, full of hope for the future, but also tinged with sadness for what I was leaving behind. The day the divorce papers were delivered, it felt like I was severing a limb. I knew it was coming, but hearing about my wife's breakdown when she got them, that hit me harder than I expected. Part of me wanted to rush over, to console her, but I knew that would just make things worse. It was a harsh reminder that actions have consequences, and mine were tearing her world apart. As word got out, I noticed a shift in my circle of friends. It's funny how these things go down. Some sided with her, giving me cold looks, but most stuck with me. They clapped me on the back, saying things like, "You deserve to be happy, man," or, "It was about time." But their support, it felt hollow. They didn't know the whole story, the pain and the complexity of it all. Back in my world with Jane, we were like two pieces of a puzzle that finally fit. We started looking for a house together, a place to start our new life. It was exciting, browsing listings, imagining ourselves in different neighborhoods. Every open house, every plan we made, it was like weaving a new tapestry for a future I never thought I'd have. But then, things took an ugly turn. My wife, out of desperation or anger, I don't know, started spreading lies about Jane. Nasty, vicious rumors that made my blood boil. She was trying to paint Jane as the villain in our story. But Jane, she was just caught in the crossfire of a decision that was mine all along. When I confronted my wife about it, it was the final nail in the coffin for any amicable terms we had left. The conversation was heated, words were exchanged that couldn't be taken back. I understood her pain, but trying to drag Jane down, that was a low blow. It was a side of her I hadn't seen before, or maybe I just refused to see. That confrontation, it was a turning point. Any lingering connection, any shared warmth we had, it just evaporated. I walked away from that meeting knowing that whatever we had once was truly over. There was no going back, no more chances for reconciliation. It was time to fully commit to my new life with Jane, leaving behind a past that was now tainted with bitterness and regret. Hey everyone, I hope you're enjoying the video so far. If you do, please take a moment to hit that like button. It really helps me out and lets me know you appreciate the content. Also, if you haven't already, consider subscribing to the channel. Subscribing is a great way to stay updated with all the latest videos and to be part of our growing community. It's quick, it's free, and it ensures you won't miss out on any upcoming content. So go ahead, smash that like button and hit subscribe. Your support means a lot and keeps this channel going. Thanks for watching. The day Jane told me she was pregnant, it was like a scene straight out of a movie. We were in our tiny kitchen, her hands shaking as she held the test. "I'm pregnant," she whispered, and suddenly the room felt too small, like the walls were closing in. It was a shock, sure, but not a bad one. In fact, it made everything clear. This was it. This was my future. Jane and our child. It was like a sign, telling me I was on the right path. News travels fast in small towns, and it wasn't long before my soon-to-be ex-wife heard about it. I can only imagine how she felt, hearing that not only was she losing her husband but now, he was starting a family with someone else. It must have been a crushing blow. I felt for her, I really did, but I also knew that we were past the point of no return. My future was with Jane now. As the divorce proceedings began, I pushed for a quick resolution. I wanted to move on, to start building my new life without any legal ties holding me back. It was a messy process, full of lawyers and paperwork, and a constant reminder of everything that had gone wrong. But through it all, I kept my eye on the prize, a new life with Jane and our baby. During this time, I noticed a shift in our mutual friends. It's strange how people take sides in a breakup, especially when the reasons are as complicated as ours were. Many of them started to distance themselves from my wife, blaming her for the failed marriage. It was unfair, and it made me uncomfortable. We both had our faults, our reasons, but it seemed like she was bearing the brunt of the blame. Meanwhile, Jane and I were moving forward. We found a house, a beautiful place with a big backyard and a room that would be perfect for the nursery. Buying that house, it was like planting a flag, declaring that this was our territory, our new beginning. Every box we unpacked. Every picture we hung on the wall. It was a step away from the past and a step towards our future. It was a time of mixed emotions. Excitement and hope for what was coming, but also a deep sadness for what I was leaving behind. My marriage had ended, and a new chapter was beginning. It was a chapter one never expected to write, but there I was, pen in hand, ready to start. There's a saying about hitting rock bottom and the only way left to go being up. Well, my wife must have felt like she was drilling through bedrock when she tried to sabotage the sale of our house. Her desperate attempts to hold on to something, anything, from our past life together were like watching someone trying to catch smoke with their bare hands. In the end, her efforts were futile, and the house sold. It was a painful yet necessary step in severing our ties. Meanwhile, life with Jane was moving at full speed. We got engaged, and it felt right. The ring, the promises, the future, it was all laid out in front of us, bright and shiny. We were building something new, something that felt like it was meant to be. Announcing our engagement felt like shouting from the rooftops, declaring to the world that we were starting anew. The divorce getting finalized was a weird mix of relief and sorrow. It's strange how a few signatures on paper can end what was once a lifetime commitment. My wife ended up with less than she'd hoped for, and I knew she was bitter about it. But the legalities needed to be settled, the ties cut cleanly. It was the only way to truly move on. Planning a wedding with Jane was a whirlwind of excitement. It was the complete opposite of my first wedding, less about pleasing family and more about us. We announced our plans, and the reaction was a mixed bag. Some were genuinely happy for us, others clearly still sided with my ex-wife. But we pushed forward, focused on creating a day that would mark the start of our new life together. In the midst of all this, I couldn't help but think about my ex-wife. She was trying to rebuild her life, but from what I heard, she was struggling. It's not easy, starting over when the world you knew crumbles beneath you. I had Jane, a new love to anchor me. My ex-wife, she was adrift, trying to find something or someone to cling to. It pained me to think of her like that, lost and alone. But we each had our paths to walk, and hers was no longer intertwined with mine. That chapter of my life, the one where she was my everything, was closed. I was starting a new chapter with Jane, but the pages of the past still lingered, a reminder of the love lost and the lessons learned. The day I married Jane was supposed to be the happiest of my life, a lavish ceremony marking the start of our new journey together. It was all set against the backdrop of this grand old hotel, with its chandeliers and sprawling gardens. Our families and friends were there, the air buzzing with excitement and joy. Jane looked stunning, like something out of a fairy tale, and I couldn't believe she was mine. But then, in a twist straight out of a soap opera, my ex-wife showed up, uninvited and clearly unbalanced. She burst through the doors during the vows, her eyes wild, shouting about how I was making the biggest mistake of my life. The room fell silent, everyone frozen in shock. Jane stood beside me, her hand gripping mine like a lifeline. The scene that unfolded was chaotic. My brother and a couple of friends had to gently escort my ex-wife out as she continued to scream and cry. It was heartbreaking to see her like that, so lost and broken. The woman I had once loved so deeply was now a stranger, consumed by her grief and anger. After that incident, Jane and I decided it was best to cut off all contact with my ex-wife. It was a hard decision, but necessary for our peace of mind. We needed to move on, to leave the past and its ghosts behind. The news of my ex-wife's downward spiral didn't stop coming. She lost her job due to her erratic behavior, a casualty of her inability to cope with our divorce and my remarriage. I felt responsible, in a way. My decisions had set off this chain reaction, but I also knew that I couldn't sacrifice my happiness for her well-being. Then, a new twist came. A mysterious man from her past reappeared, offering her support. I heard about it through mutual friends, curious whispers painting a picture of this enigmatic figure stepping in during her time of need. Who was he? An old flame? A forgotten friend? His timing was impeccable, entering the scene just when she was at her lowest. This development was a strange comfort to me. Maybe, just maybe, this man could provide her the stability and support she needed, something I could no longer give. As Jane and I settled into our married life, I couldn't help but hope that my ex-wife would find some semblance of peace and start her journey towards healing and happiness. Life has a way of throwing curveballs, and the news about my ex-wife getting involved with some mysterious guy was one of them. I heard it through the grapevine she'd found someone, a man from her past. I should have felt something, maybe jealousy or concern, but all I felt was indifference. My life had moved on, and hers was her own business now. Meanwhile, in our world, Jane and I were on cloud nine. She gave birth to a beautiful baby girl, and holding my daughter for the first time was a feeling I can't even begin to describe. It was a moment that cemented everything I felt about my new life. Jane and I were a family now, and our little girl was the embodiment of our love and commitment. But not all stories have happy turns. I later found out that things weren't so rosy for my ex-wife. Her new relationship, which had started as a beacon of hope, had turned dark. Rumors swirled that the guy was abusive, that she was in a bad situation. Part of me wanted to reach out, to help somehow, but another part held back, knowing that it wasn't my place anymore. It was a complicated mix of emotions, but I had to focus on my own family. The year flew by, and soon we were celebrating our daughter's first birthday. Jane and I, along with our friends and family, surrounded our little girl with love and laughter. It was a day filled with joy, a stark contrast to the whispers of trouble in my ex-wife's life. As I watched my daughter smash her cake with tiny fists, I couldn't help but feel grateful for the path I had chosen, despite the bumps along the way. Life, I realized, is a series of choices and consequences. I had made mine, and my ex-wife had made hers. As I looked at Jane and our daughter, I knew that no matter what happened in the past, I was exactly where I needed to be. Life's like a river, constantly moving, sometimes calm, sometimes turbulent. I heard through a friend of a friend that my ex-wife was trying to leave her new guy, the mysterious man who turned out to be not so Prince Charming after all. Part of me felt a pang of something, pity, maybe? But it was her battle, her life, and I had my own to manage. Since Jane and I settled down and with our little girl in the picture, people began seeing me in a new light. I was the guy who made it through a rough patch and came off the other side, a devoted single dad who found love again. It felt weird, getting all this sympathy and support for just living my life, but it was there, a constant hum in the background of our day-to-day. Then came a twist that nobody saw coming. My ex-wife found out that her new man was tied to some old mistakes of hers. Talk about a bad turn in an already rocky road. The details were sketchy, but the gist was that her past was catching up with her in the worst way. It's strange how life loops back on itself, how yesterday's choices show up in today's problems. Meanwhile, I was in a good place. My career was on the upswing, Jane and I were stronger than ever. Our daughter was growing up fast, a little beacon of joy in our lives. We were building something real and solid, a far cry from the chaos of my past life. The last I heard about my ex-wife, things had gone south, big time. She'd lost everything, her new relationship, her friends, her sense of self. It was a hard pill to swallow, knowing that someone I once shared my life with was now a shell of her former self. But at the same time, our lives had diverged so drastically that it was like hearing about a distant acquaintance. I had moved on, and her life was her own. It's funny how life works out. You make a series of choices, and you never really know where they're going to lead you. I chose Jane, chose to start over, and somehow, despite all the odds, it worked out. My ex-wife made her choices too, and they led her down a different path. As I looked at my family, at Jane and our daughter, I knew I had no regrets.